API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code INTERSECTION10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Hello again, API Intersection listeners. We are back today with a little something different is what I usually tell you. That's become the mantra. So I say that this time in that we talk a lot about building APIs. And, sometimes lately we talk a lot about product managing APIs. But today I want to, look at consuming APIs and kind of what it's like to be on that end of, I've got to make all the API calls. And in this case, do a whole bunch of different ones and a whole bunch of different sizes, flavors, shapes, and smells. So today I want to introduce Mathieu from Meta API as our guest. So
Hi,
Mathieu,
Jason.
thank you for joining. Did I say your name right? Did I screw it up?
Yes, perfectly.
Not you. Yeah. Okay, I got it right. Okay, good. Unfortunately, our co-host Anna will not be able to make it today, which I'm sad about, but that's okay. It'll just be me and you. So we'll get into it. So I guess tell us a little bit about yourself and what Meta API does.
So I'm Mathieu. I'm the CEO of Meta API. And at Meta API, we are focused on helping developers to integrate and create automation between APIs. So we want to release some pain from all of aspects when you are developing this kind of integration, like automation, deployment, hosting, etc. And we want to help them to focus on code, focus on business logic, and like Lego bricks, you take it, you plug it together, and it's working.
Got it. So kind of part of the API aggregator space, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So, I mean, certainly begs the question when you look at some of these things as like, you look at the major APIs that are out there that people typically use, and why don't they just call it directly, right? Like, why do they need you? And I think that's what I want to unpack today a little bit. More than like, tell me the value points of your company. It's like, what are these struggles that that folks have in trying to consume APIs, and what are kind of the gotchas? I think for some listeners who may be saying, I'm learning more about APIs, I want to start incorporating more use of APIs in what I'm building. What should I watch out for, right?
The first one and the most painful one is the authentication. And in particular, when you have to deal with authentication like OAuth2, which is very, very painful to implement. And we have like a magic button when you click it and it's done. So that's helping a lot. So that's the first one. And the second one is about everything around your integration, because you have to think when you create an integration, you want to make it inside your own code or inside an external project, maybe another API. And so you will have multiple complexity, like where am I to deploy it? How I can manage security, updates, etc. And that's can very painful when you just escape from the integration part and then I have now the something to do with integration, security, deployment, how I can manage it on my CI/CD system. That's thing we want to it's one thing we want to help and say, okay, just press deploy and that's it.
Yeah, as the old adage goes, if it's a 2-day hackathon, day one is off, right? No one actually builds anything on the first day. So it seems like you've mentioned kind of OpenAPI sort of stuff quite a bit, and I'm curious, like, how does OpenAPI, which we normally think of, certainly in my world, of this is what folks use in their development process by putting that design, that abstract design in front, and then kind of designing first before building, and then generating code and tools. Is it that the kind of code gen factor for your client is valuable, or is there something more to it?
So when you finished on your side to design and implement your OpenAPI, our platform and our job start at this point when we take it, and unless unless our competitors, we want to, for creating integration, you have to rebuild everything with their own SDK or their own principle. Our point is to say, okay, we have already an OpenAPI, standard specification file. So we want to take it and say, okay, that's our entry point. And we take it, we grab it, and we push it to our engine to generate everything. We generate connectors from this OpenAPI file. And that's very interesting because we can, with this technique, we can both address public APIs. We are giving their own OpenAPI file, but also private API. And we can create this mix of all API together. And that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, OpenAPI specifically, its history starts as Swagger, where it was basically generating documentation was the original purpose of it.
Exactly.
So clearly, generating stuff from the spec is the kind of the point, right? As much in my world of API design, we think a lot about it as a design tool. It's like, got to remember, downstream folks used this to consume things. But I mean, what are the sticking points? I mean, is it that generated code doesn't work sometimes? What's kind of missing for you around the OpenAPI ecosystem in terms of consumption?
Which are missing instead of concept. We would like for any APIs to have like a very well done SDK, like Stripe or this kind of tool. We have like a full team creating and making this kind of SDK. And for example, one thing we pushed on our side is to parse and extract automatically schema from the OpenAPI and project it inside the code editor of the platform. So when you manipulate an API and you want to access data, you have like auto-completion of your data you are getting from some endpoints. So that's kind of consumption our developer want to have. That's kind of experience they want to have and to achieve. And of course, all the simplification of authentication, as I said.
All right. I think you may generate a tweet storm there. If I summarize the first thing you said is what's missing in open APIs? SDKs.
That's it.
But it's interesting in that there's also the question of how does that open API generate code and who does it? And part of what you're getting at, I think, is if there is a well-documented, easy-to-use SDK, then having an open API to generate a client yourself is less important.
Yes, and it's interesting because my the first time I encountered an open API inside the web, it was through the Swagger editor, so it's back on Swagger time, and the first thing that blew my mind at this time is to have an interactive documentation and say, wow, I just fill the form. It's a standard request and it's done. Wow, I want it inside my my application right now.
Yeah. Clearly, we're fascinated with that too at Stoplight. We do quite a bit of that sort of thing. But it's interesting too that you point out that there's some pretty significant sort of public API programs or very large even sort of partner in some frame that don't really have an easy pattern in which to consume. There's not an SDK and there's not anything with which to generate code. So, I mean, I'm curious for you, and when you look at, you have no artifact to generate from, you have no SDK. What do you think that the sort of delta of time is in that scenario versus having those things?
Oh, yeah, that's the complicated part when you just have a plain HTML documentation, or even worse, I have
PDF?
some
You're going to say
yeah.
PDF, aren't you? Yeah.
And PDF documentation in PDF, and snippet of code are not text; they are just a screenshot of image. That's
Oh, wow.
that's the kind of hell you can encounter. So at this point, the only way to go from this is to recreate the OpenAPI specification file, because we wrote this. We can do anything. We can create proper versioning. We can share it inside, even inside our team. We are many to work on this, and that's why OpenAPI is so important, because it's also enable collaboration on the same file, and you can have versioning inside like GitHub, and that's the starting point. You can build something resilient without this kind of foundation.
Yeah. I'm curious, I'd imagine that you've ended up interacting with quite a few of these programs back and forth. And, in those interactions where, you're maybe saying like, why don't you have something like this? What's your read on why this is the case? Why folks aren't providing that sort of thing?
The first thing, I think it's a lack of knowledge that this kind of standard exists, and there are some also misconception about OpenAPI. I think people think about when you have SOAP API and you have to read very strict schema, and that's
Whistles
not
and
what
waddles. Yeah.
that's not what OpenAPI is. It's just a description of what you are making. You can omit some parameters or some details inside schema. That's okay, but there must be taken as a starting point of creating a documentation both for the human, and thanks to JSON or YAML, it's very readable, and for human and for machine, and that's all the point. And also, I think that sometimes developers team want to make something proprietary only, and they just stick with the all the methods they have. So they are like writing documentation or Word, or making a PDF, or having an internet documentation like a wiki or something like that, and they are just take that from this part, creating a basic HTML file and pushing it online. So I see more and more documentation which are generated by tools like Stoplight. We can see, of course, Redoc or this kind of solution. So that's great. That means that before that, the inside their building parts, there is that approach to create a file, a very nice file with versioning, and you have this design process. That's why I want to say this design process before.
I'm going to read into that and guess that what you're getting at is that quite often documentation is not accurate with the API that you're calling.
Maybe 25 or 40% of the time we have,
wow.
so much difference between the OpenAPI and the reality. Sometimes it's mostly inside the schema. In our first version, we were doing like some schema matching and schema verification between data coming from the API and the schema declared inside the OpenAPI. And we stopped doing that because it was consuming too much resources and we we get too many errors.
Yeah.
So because everything is moving, APIs are moving parts all the time, and unless you are like big actors like Google or very big company which are very, very robust and non-moving API, it's very difficult for so many actors to not have moving parts inside the API.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny because on one hand, we go, gosh, why don't you have more features and more things that I can do? And then on the other hand, quit changing things. Right? It's definitely the plight of API builders is like, once it's out there, you can't change it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do, you break everyone and everyone's mad. But then if you don't change anything, then it's beg for more, right? So yeah, I mean, I think summing that up, it's like, if there's nothing, it's the worst case because, I mean, and you didn't give me a ballpark on time, but it sounds like you're spending a lot more time if there's no SDK, no open API, nothing to generate or consume that's prepackaged. And then somewhere in the middle is poorly documented is better than nothing. But
it's better than nothing. And the most frustrating part is about error management when you have like you try to implement something, you have a parcel documentation, you see, you check multiple endpoints. We say, okay, I must go inside the developer's mind to say, okay, he do it like this. and then you have an error and like 500 errors and no message, nothing. You say
the black hole.
Exactly. And that's terrible.
Yeah.
Because you start creating something and you are just stop inside, block inside your momentum, and it's very, very frustrating.
Yeah. I think, there's like this next order up, and I think you're touching on some of this where it's like you can have the kind of well-documented API with weird paths, right? And that's to say not truly well-documented. So it's like you can describe how to consume it and all the schema and all the parameters and all that stuff, but to some extent, documentation QA has to be a mindset of fail first. Is what's the first thing that most developers interact with in an API? It's an error, right?
Yes.
We just said auth is hard, so you're going to hit lots of errors. Make sure that you document that part. Seems obvious, but yeah.
And I read a very good article about error management, and always have inside your error the error, the context, and a way to solve it. And the context is very, very important because sometimes you have an error and you don't know why it's coming. Is it coming from bad parameters, bad authentication, maybe a missing part or missing feature inside the service you want to interact with. So bringing some context around this error is a very good practice to say, okay, I must think as a consumer, they will see this error. So this error need to be, self-explanatory to say, okay, that's the problem, and I know I should go to this part of the documentation or this part of the platform to solve it.
Yeah, I would always point folks to the problem details for HTTP APIs, the RFC 7807. Actually, one of our former guests, and I've been a guest on his YouTube thing too, Eric Vilda, worked on that quite a bit years ago. And it's like you don't have to make up how to do errors. Like, there's a format for that. And there's a whole RFC that describes how to do it. So yeah, I love that. Well, we usually do this when we're this kind of question when we're thinking about, hey, you've built out this whole API program with all the processes that we've been touching on that you wish that people were following. But I'm curious in terms of, building this sort of engine for consuming APIs, because I think what you're doing is applicable anywhere, even if they're not using a product like yours, is, think about consumption and all the things that you're going to have to do. And there's reusability. Is like, if you had to go build it all again from where you're at now, what would have been the most important thing that you would start on first or focus on first? What have you learned from this experience?
About thinking of error management, we address also on our part, we address this aspect very lately, and also on our side, we left some user on the early version of Meta API, like in darkness, with giving them not not enough context and not enough error, and you can't. We tried this project with this kind of mindset. We say, okay, we addressed our platform to developers. They know how developing works. So why we have to explain like what is an HTTP error, what we have to explain this kind of error, and you have to do this. We underestimate too much the level of our user, and not being condescending, but it's to say we don't know the level. We have to explain everything every time, and just go back to the basis and explain everything that happened to the inside the platform. And the second part will be to be transparent on what process all the automation you are doing on our backend, what we are doing, and how we are making some wiring or plumbing between APIs, because sometimes it's you can have weird behavior, but you have in front of you like a black box, and you don't know. You just know what's going on and out, and you don't know what's happening inside, and you can figure out how to improve that. So it's very critical to explain what's going on inside. And as every time, once it's explained, it could be opinionated. It could be, okay, our way is to do it like that, and that's okay. Some will like, some who doesn't, but at least you explain it. You explain all your process, all your mind, your mind trail, and starting from that, people and user will understand and say, okay, that's working this way, so I can do it. I can fix it the way I want.
Yeah, it's it's funny. We just talked a bunch about how API builders need to think about their APIs, but I think in the space of aggregating APIs, or even in some implementations, you're doing like a pass through where you're calling one thing and then something else is chaining up upstream from you. Is like how you pass through errors in that scenario. If you're not thoughtful about it, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's different. It's a different situation for each API, and there's not a lot of reusability there because the logic between each application is very different as to what produces errors. And we already said the consistency of errors is very different depending on the publisher.
Yes, exactly. So
yeah.
So that's the work part, and that's on something we want to work later from our platform to maybe to inject some AI or machine learning inside that to, have a way to standardize something that had been created by a human. Like, you have an error on an API, and the API is responding with a HTTP 200, and inside the response you have error with your error. That's terrible.
So what you're saying is you're going to train the robots to read those developers' minds, right?
Exactly.
Nice. Cool. Well, kind of feels like a pretty good closing point. Any other, closing thoughts for us?
Yes. A message I want to say to everything we are listeners is about API, and I saw too many companies around us who fear to open their API or to open their data, and it's not like open your gate, open your company, and everyone can steal everything from you. See, it's an API, so you have control on it. You can select what you want to share and not share, and that's the best way. Having an API is the best way to put your product or your service inside a whole ecosystem you can't imagine, and that's it's the critical part. And you also help your user to automate all they are trying to do, and you sometimes you can't rely only on a graphic interface. You have to deal with machine and with program, and having an API is the best way to address that.
Yeah, I think you're preaching to the choir on this show, but I will say I think over the last couple of years, a lot of that perception's changed, where
Yes.
more and more companies are now realizing, yeah, we were thinking that way for a long time, and if we don't change gears fast, we're going to be in trouble. And the data's out there now, like competitively. Studies have been done on these things, and like companies with sort of a well-developed, mature kind of API are far more competitive in today's market, in part because it's an ecosystem, right? How do you connect within that ecosystem? If you're a standalone thing that you can only point and click on, you can't benefit from all the other growth of other platforms.
And we saw with the COVID crisis how fast company could change with API and transform this business and adapt. And without that, we will be stuck inside, your own state and unable to move. With an API, you can say, okay, so I need to move. I can create new endpoints, a new interface, and that's it. I can keep my core businesses alive and create some peripheral new feature around.
Well, I think you may have picked the most non-controversial closing thought ever. You came on the API show and you said, folks, companies should have APIs. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're all cheering the same right now. So we're with you. We're behind you. And I think we hope more and more that folks that are just thinking about whether or not they should are listening and take it to heart. So, well, Mathieu, I really appreciate you sharing kind of everything that you've learned in this, and wish you the best of luck with your company going forward.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.